My dad looked me straight in the eyes and said, "You're not invited." I wish that had been the worst part. 3 days later, the same man called begging me for $57,000. If you think I helped him after what happened, stick with me because the truth is far more painful than anyone expected. My name is Leora Shaw. I'm 29 years old and I've spent most of my life believing that if I loved my family enough, one day they would love me the same way. I worked as a physical therapist, picked up extra shifts whenever I could, and never complained when someone needed my help. My parents always said I had the biggest heart in the family. Looking back now, I realize they only remembered that whenever they needed something from me. My younger sister, Bryn, was different. She always seemed to get everything she wanted. If she wanted a new car, somehow it appeared. If she dreamed of a vacation, my parents found the money. Every family celebration somehow became about her, and everyone acted as if that was perfectly normal. Years earlier, my father, Grant, suffered a serious heart condition that required emergency treatment. Without thinking twice, I emptied nearly all of my savings to make sure he got the care he needed. I never asked for praise or even expected the money back. I only wanted my dad to survive. When Bryn got engaged, I was genuinely happy for her. I helped her compare wedding venues, listened to endless conversations about flowers and dresses, and assumed I'd be sitting with the rest of the family on her big day. Weeks passed without an invitation, but I convinced myself it was just delayed. A few days before the wedding, I stopped by my parents' house to ask what time everyone should arrive. My mom avoided looking at me. My stomach tightened before anyone even spoke. My father stepped into the hallway and closed the front door behind him. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "Leora, Bryn thinks it's better if you don't come." I stared at him, waiting for the rest of the sentence. He folded his arms and said, "She wants a perfect day without unnecessary tension. It's what she wants and we're respecting her decision." I felt like the ground disappeared beneath me. I searched his face for some sign that this was a cruel joke, but there was nothing. No apology. No regret. Just a father choosing one daughter while quietly pushing the other out of the family. I turned around, walked to my car and drove away with one question repeating in my mind. What had I done to deserve this? The morning of the wedding arrived with perfect weather. Sunlight filled my apartment and for a brief moment I forgot what day it was. Then I looked at the calendar and the weight settled back on my chest. Somewhere across town, my sister was getting ready to walk down the aisle while the rest of my family laughed together as if I had never existed. I tried to keep myself busy. I cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry that didn't need folding, and reorganized a bookshelf simply to give my hands something to do. Every few minutes, my mind wandered back to the wedding. I pictured my parents greeting guests with proud smiles, my father walking Bryn down the aisle and relatives asking where I was. I wondered what answer they had come up with. As the hours passed, memories I had buried for years came rushing back. Every birthday where Bryn opened twice as many presents. Every Christmas morning when she got exactly what she wished for while I smiled and pretended not to notice the difference. At my high school graduation, my parents arrived late because Bryn had a dance competition. When I earned my degree, they left early because she had plans with friends. I kept telling myself they didn't mean to hurt me. I spent years making excuses for people who never apologized. By evening, I stopped wondering what the wedding looked like. I realized imagining it only gave more space to people who had already pushed me away. When I checked my mailbox later that night, I found a small envelope with my name written in shaky handwriting. Inside was a handwritten card from one of my elderly patients. A few months earlier, I'd helped him recover after hip surgery. He wrote that because of my patience and encouragement, he had been able to dance with his wife again for the first time in years. At the bottom, he thanked me for treating him with kindness when he felt forgotten. I read those words more than once. It struck me that a man I had known for only a short time had made me feel more valued than my own family had in years. Sitting alone in my living room, I finally accepted a painful truth. Love shouldn't have to be earned over and over again. I was exhausted from chasing people who only noticed me when it was convenient. I picked up my phone, opened my contacts, and looked at my parents' names saved under my favorites. My thumb hovered for a second before I removed them. For the first time in a long while, I believed I was finally ready to stop waiting for them to choose me. 3 days passed in complete silence. No messages. No explanation. No apology for shutting me out of the biggest family event of the year. I slowly started believing that maybe the distance between us was permanent. As painful as that thought was, it also brought a strange sense of peace. Then just after 6 in the morning my phone began ringing. I reached for it without looking, expecting it to be the hospital where I worked asking if I could cover an early shift. Instead my father's name lit up the screen. I stared at it until the call stopped. A few seconds later it rang again. Then again. By the 5th call I answered. Hello. My father's breathing was uneven. He sounded nothing like the calm man who had told me I wasn't welcome at Bryn's wedding. Leora, he said quickly, thank goodness you picked up. I waited. There was an accident. My stomach tightened. Cole was hurt late last night. He's at the hospital. The doctors say he needs emergency surgery. For a brief moment I forgot everything that had happened between us. No matter how angry I was, I never wanted anyone seriously injured. Is he going to be okay? I asked. They're trying, my father replied. But there's a problem. He explained that the insurance company hadn't approved the claim yet because of paperwork that still needed processing. Until everything was verified, the hospital required a payment of $57,000 before moving forward with part of the treatment plan. I listened quietly, expecting him to finally say the words I had waited 3 days to hear. I'm sorry. I was wrong. You should have been there. Instead he took a deep breath and said, we need you to help us. Not once did he mention the wedding. Not once did he ask how I was doing. He went straight to the money. You've always been responsible, he continued. You still have savings, don't you? We need $57,000 today. We'll figure everything else out later. Everything else. That was how he described throwing his own daughter away. I closed my eyes and remembered standing outside their front door while he told me I didn't belong at my sister's wedding. The hurt I had pushed aside came rushing back all at once. He kept talking, explaining how desperate the situation was and how the family was counting on me. Every sentence made it clearer that this wasn't about repairing our relationship. It was about what I could provide. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply sat there in silence, letting his words hang between us. Finally I said only one sentence. I need to think. Before he could answer I ended the call. I placed the phone on the table and stared at it, realizing that after everything they had done, the first reason they reached out was because they needed my money. After I ended the call I couldn't focus on anything else. My father wanted an answer immediately, but something inside me refused to make another sacrifice without understanding why everything always seemed to fall on my shoulders. I walked into the small room I used as a home office and pulled out a storage box that had followed me through 2 apartments. Inside were old folders, receipts, bank statements, and medical paperwork I had never bothered to throw away. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I just needed to clear my head. As I flipped through the files, I found a thick envelope with my father's name written across the front. The date instantly caught my attention. It was from the year he had been rushed into emergency heart treatment. I remembered those weeks clearly. I had worked extra shifts, emptied my savings account, and even sold a few personal belongings because every dollar mattered. My parents had promised they would make things right once everything settled down. I believed them without question because they were my family. I spread the papers across the table. There were hospital invoices, payment confirmations, and copies of cashier's checks with my name on them. Seeing those numbers again made my chest tighten. That money had taken years to save. It had been my emergency fund, my future home, and every vacation I never took. Then one document stopped me. It wasn't something I remembered seeing before. Across the top were the words, insurance reimbursement. I frowned and kept reading. The insurance company had completed its review several months after my father's surgery. According to the statement, they approved nearly all of the medical expenses and issued a reimbursement for almost the full amount that had already been paid. My heart started racing. I checked the next page. The refund had not been mailed to me. It had been electronically deposited into my parents' bank account. I read the page again, convinced I had misunderstood something. Then I checked the account number listed on the statement. It matched one of my parents' old banking records that I'd seen countless times growing up. They had received the money. Every dollar that I thought was gone forever had come back. Yet no one had ever called to tell me. No one had thanked me. No one had offered to repay what I had sacrificed. Instead, they let me believe that my savings had disappeared for good while I struggled to rebuild my finances from the ground up. I leaned back in my chair, unable to look away from the papers spread across the desk. The phone call from my father suddenly sounded different in my mind. He hadn't called because he finally cared about me. He had called because he expected me to save the family again. Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't only from heartbreak anymore. They were from realizing the truth. The money I had given up out of love had never truly been lost. It had simply been kept from me by the people I trusted the most. The documents kept running through my mind. I barely slept that night, and by morning I knew I couldn't keep guessing. There had to be someone who could explain what I was looking at. One name stood out immediately. Reed Lawson had handled legal matters for my parents for as long as I could remember. He had known our family since I was a teenager, and if anyone knew what had happened to that insurance money, it was him. I called his office and asked if he had a few minutes to meet. His assistant found an opening that afternoon. When I walked into his office, Reed greeted me with a warm smile, but it disappeared the moment he saw the stack of papers in my hands. "I found these," I said quietly as I placed the documents on his desk. He adjusted his glasses and slowly looked through each page. His expression grew heavier with every document. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. "So, you didn't know?" His words caught me off guard. "Know what?" I asked. He looked genuinely confused. "I always believed your parents had explained everything to you years ago." I felt my stomach sink. "Explained what?" Reed folded his hands together before speaking carefully. "After your father's treatment, the insurance company approved a reimbursement. The money was deposited into your parents' account. I handled some of the paperwork myself." I nodded slowly. "I figured that part out. But they never gave it back." He lowered his eyes for a moment. "No," he admitted. "They didn't." The room felt strangely quiet. I asked the question I was almost afraid to hear answered. "What happened to the money?" Reed hesitated. "I can't discuss every detail of their finances, but I can confirm something because these records involve your payment." He opened another file from his cabinet and compared a few dates. "A large portion of that reimbursement was transferred into a savings account your parents created for Bryn shortly after it arrived. Over the following years, those funds were used for wedding deposits, venue payments, and several other family expenses." For a few seconds I couldn't speak. Images from the wedding I never attended filled my mind. The elegant venue. The flowers. The music. The beautiful dress everyone had praised. My own savings had helped pay for it. The money I gave to save my father's life had quietly become part of the celebration I wasn't even allowed to attend. "I thought you already knew," Reed said softly. "If I had realized no one told you, this conversation would have happened a long time ago." I looked down at the papers scattered across his desk. The rejection hurt before. Now it felt even deeper. They hadn't simply forgotten to repay me. They had taken the money that belonged to me, spent it building my sister's dream wedding, smiled through every celebration, and still found the courage to call me days later asking for $57,000 as if I owed them one more sacrifice. After leaving Reed Lawson's office, I drove home in complete silence. The papers sat on the passenger seat beside me, but they felt much heavier than a few sheets of paper. Every promise my parents had made suddenly sounded empty. I kept asking myself how they could watch me struggle for years while knowing the money had already been returned to them. My phone started ringing before I even reached my apartment. It was my father. I let it ring until it stopped. A minute later he called again. Then another time. When I finally answered, there was no panic left in his voice. The fear I had heard days earlier had turned into frustration. "Lyra, what is taking so long?" he demanded. "This isn't the time to make us wait." I stayed calm. "I've been looking into something." He ignored my words. "Cole's condition isn't getting any easier. We need that money today." For the first time in my life, I didn't rush to fix his problems. Instead, I asked one simple question. "Why didn't you ever return the insurance reimbursement after your heart surgery?" The line went completely quiet. A few seconds later he cleared his throat. "This isn't about the past." "It is for me," I replied. Before he could answer, my mother took the phone. Her voice carried disappointment instead of concern. "I can't believe you're choosing this moment to bring up old issues," she said. "Your sister's husband is in the hospital, and you're making everything about yourself." I closed my eyes for a second. "I gave up everything I had for Dad," I answered quietly. "I only want to know why none of that money ever came back." She avoided the question. Families don't keep score. I almost laughed at the irony. Apparently, families weren't supposed to keep score when I was the one giving. A few moments later, Bryn joined the call. She sounded upset. "I don't understand why you're acting like this," she said. "Family should always help family." Her words stung more than she could have imagined. I wanted to ask whether family also excluded each other from weddings. Whether family spent someone else's money without telling them. Whether family remembered your phone number only when they needed your bank account. Instead, I simply repeated my question. "What happened to the reimbursement?" No one answered. They changed the subject. They talked about the hospital. They talked about Cole. They talked about responsibility. Not one of them admitted what they had done years earlier. Finally, my father spoke again. "If anything happens because you refuse to help, you'll have to live with that." I looked at the documents spread across my kitchen table. For years I had carried guilt that never belonged to me. I blamed myself whenever my parents were disappointed, convinced myself I simply needed to try harder, give more and ask for less. Not anymore. "I won't send a single dollar," I said calmly, "until someone tells me the truth." No explanation came. Only more accusations. As the call ended, something inside me finally changed. For the first time, I wasn't the one carrying the weight of their choices anymore. The conversation with my family stayed in my mind for days. They had blamed me for everything without answering a single question. I knew the insurance reimbursement wasn't the whole story. Too many things from the past suddenly stopped making sense. I needed facts, not guesses. Because I had once handled parts of my father's hospital paperwork, I contacted the hospital's administrative office. After explaining my involvement in the original payments, I was referred to Nora Brakes, a senior administrator who specialized in financial records. She welcomed me into her office with a professional but kind attitude. I handed her the copies of the reimbursement documents and explained why I was there. "I just want to understand where everything went," I said. Nora carefully reviewed the paperwork before opening several archived files on her computer. After a long silence, she looked back at me. "There are records here that you're entitled to see because they involve payments made from your personal accounts." She printed several pages and placed them in front of me. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. Then she pointed to a series of dates. "The reimbursement arrived much sooner than expected," she explained. "Based on these records, your parents recovered almost all of the treatment costs within a few months." I nodded. "I already know they received it." She hesitated before continuing. "There's something else." The financial timeline showed that shortly after receiving the money, my parents opened a high-interest savings account. Over the following years, the balance continued to grow through regular deposits. I stared at the numbers. "They said they were barely getting by," I whispered. Nora gave a careful response. "I'm only speaking about what's documented here, but these records don't suggest a family facing serious financial hardship." Suddenly, memories began falling into place. The countless times I had asked for help with tuition and been told there wasn't enough money. The evenings I worked double shifts because my old car kept breaking down while my parents insisted they couldn't contribute $1. The birthdays when Bryn somehow received expensive gifts despite everyone claiming the budget was tight. Even the vacation my parents said had been paid for with careful saving happened during the same period these accounts kept growing. The problem had never been a lack of money. It was where they chose to spend it. Every time I struggled alone, they had the ability to help. They simply chose not to. Instead, they invested in Bryn's future while encouraging me to sacrifice a little more, work a little harder and expect a little less. I felt tears filling my eyes, but they didn't fall. The sadness that had followed me for years slowly gave way to something stronger. The truth hurt more than I ever imagined, yet it also freed me from believing I had somehow failed my family. I hadn't been overlooked because I wasn't enough. I had been overlooked because they decided someone else mattered more. As I gathered the documents and thanked Nora, I realized I wasn't searching for their approval anymore. I was searching for justice, and for the first time I believed I was finally strong enough to find it. Over the next several days the calls became less frequent, but I knew that didn't mean the situation had improved. Through brief conversations with the hospital, I learned that Cole's condition had become more complicated than anyone expected. His treatment couldn't be delayed forever and my family was running out of time. I also heard they had tried everything else first. They had applied for emergency loans, contacted relatives, and even asked their bank for additional credit. Every option had fallen through. Only after every door closed did they come back to the daughter they had pushed away. One rainy afternoon there was a knock on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I looked through the peephole, I saw my father standing in the hallway. For a second I considered pretending I wasn't home, but instead I unlocked the door. Grant looked older than I remembered. His shoulders were slumped, and the confidence he usually carried was gone. He stepped inside slowly and glanced around my apartment. "I've never been here," he said quietly. He was right. I had lived there for nearly 3 years and he had never once asked to visit. I offered him a chair and we sat across from each other in silence. Finally he spoke. "Leora, I'm sorry." Those were the words I had wanted to hear for years. But something about them felt empty. Before I could respond, he continued. "I know things haven't been perfect between us." Then he took a deep breath. "We still need the $57,000. There was. The apology had lasted only a few seconds before the real reason for his visit returned. He wasn't there to repair our relationship. He was there because he had nowhere else to go. Without saying a word, I stood up and walked to my desk. I picked up the folder that had barely left my side since my meeting with Reed Lawson and Nora Briggs. Returning to the table, I placed the documents in front of him. He looked down at the first page. His eyes moved across the insurance reimbursement statement. Then to the bank deposit confirmation. Then to the records showing where the money had gone. The color slowly drained from his face. His hands stopped moving. For the first time since he arrived, he couldn't find a single word to say. I watched him realize that the truth was no longer hidden. I knew about the reimbursement. I knew they had kept the money. I knew it had helped pay for Bryn's future while I rebuilt my life from nothing. He swallowed hard and closed the folder without looking at me. The silence between us said more than any argument ever could. He stood from his chair, walked toward the front door and rested his hand on the doorknob. For a moment I thought he might finally explain everything. Instead he lowered his head, opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Without another word he walked away, leaving behind the papers, and every excuse he had ever hoped I would believe. A week after my father walked out of my apartment, Reed Lawson called and asked if I could meet him. He believed the situation had reached a point where everyone needed to sit down and face the facts instead of hiding behind excuses. He arranged a legal mediation so the financial records could be reviewed by everyone involved. It wasn't a courtroom, but it was the first time my family would have to answer questions they had avoided for years. When I arrived, my parents were already there. My father stared at the table without saying a word. My mother looked nervous and Bryn seemed completely confused. She clearly had no idea why Reed had asked her to come. Reed placed several folders in front of us. "I think it's time everyone understands what actually happened," he said. He carefully explained the timeline, starting with my father's heart treatment. He showed proof that I had paid the hospital bills from my own savings. Then he presented the insurance reimbursement records showing that nearly all of those expenses had later been returned to my parents. No one interrupted him. The room stayed completely still. Next came the bank statements. Every transfer matched the documents I had already seen. Money that should have been returned to me had instead been moved into accounts connected to future wedding expenses and other family purchases. Bryn leaned forward and picked up one of the pages. She read it twice before looking at our parents. "What is this?" she asked quietly. Neither of them answered. She looked at another document. Then another. Her expression slowly changed from confusion to disbelief. "You told me you spent years saving for my wedding." My father remained silent. Bryn's voice became louder. "You said every payment came from your own money." Still nothing. She turned toward my mother. Was this true? My mother lowered her eyes. "We were going to explain someday." Bryn stood up so quickly that her chair scraped across the floor. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You let me celebrate that wedding without telling me it was partly paid for with money that belonged to Leora." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. I didn't know. I believed her. For the first time since all of this began, I saw genuine shock instead of excuses. The room filled with heavy silence. Relatives who had quietly supported my parents during the wedding now understood why I had disappeared. They realized I hadn't refused to attend out of bitterness. I had been pushed out while carrying a secret burden I didn't even know existed. Questions came one after another. Why wasn't the money returned? Why did no one tell Leora? How long had everyone been hiding this? My parents had no answers that made sense. Years of carefully protected stories collapsed in a single afternoon. The blame they had always directed toward me no longer worked because the documents spoke for themselves. As everyone left the meeting, my family wasn't united anymore. The lies that had been buried for years had finally reached the surface, and no one could pretend they had never happened. Several months passed and life slowly became quieter. The endless phone calls stopped. The arguments disappeared. For the first time in years, I woke up without wondering what problem I would have to solve for someone else. It felt strange at first, but little by little I began to enjoy the peace I had spent so long searching for. The mediation eventually ended with an agreement. My parents were required to repay the money that should have been returned to me years earlier. It didn't erase the hurt, but it finally acknowledged the truth. I wasn't imagining the betrayal. It had happened and now everyone knew it. Instead of spending that money trying to impress anyone, I used it to build a future that belonged to me. I bought my first home, a small place with a bright kitchen, a quiet backyard, and enough space to finally feel settled. The day I received the keys, I stood in the empty living room and smiled. No one could take this moment away from me. Every wall represented a fresh start instead of another sacrifice. Work also became more meaningful. Every day I met patients who were fighting to recover after illness or injury. Helping them stand, walk, and regain confidence reminded me that healing wasn't only physical. Sometimes people needed someone to believe in them until they could believe in themselves again. Outside of work, my life grew in ways I never expected. Friends invited me to dinners without expecting anything in return. Neighbors greeted me by name. I discovered that respect felt very different from constantly trying to earn someone's approval. One afternoon there was another knock at my front door. When I opened it, my parents were standing there together. They looked older than I remembered. The financial consequences of everything that had happened had changed their lives. They no longer carried the certainty that everything would always work out. My father spoke first. "We know we can't change the past." My mother quietly added, "We're asking if you'll give us another chance." I invited them inside, listened to every word they wanted to say, and noticed something important. For the first time, they weren't asking for money. They weren't asking me to solve another crisis. They simply wanted forgiveness. When they finished, I thanked them for coming. Then I answered as honestly as I could. "I don't hate either of you anymore." Both of them looked relieved. "But forgiving you doesn't mean we can go back to the way things were." The room became silent. "I've spent too many years chasing a place in this family," I continued. "I'm finally living a life where I don't have to beg to be loved." I wished them good health and hoped they would learn from everything that had happened. Then I walked them to the front door. As I watched them leave, I realized the greatest revenge had never been refusing to give them $57,000. It was finally choosing myself after a lifetime of choosing everyone else, and finding the peace I had been searching for all along.